Mom!
What did you say, baby?
The laughter had been endless, just moments before high, glittering laughter that echoed off marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white gloves floated like ghosts between tuxedos and silk gowns, refilling champagne flutes before they could run dry. It was the Hale Foundation Gala, the most exclusive night of the year. Every flash of a camera was another headline waiting to happen. But the moment that laugh broke the air, soft, warm, Caribbean, the whole room seemed to bend around it. Mr. Preston Hale, billionaire CEO, lover of the spotlight, paused mid-sentence. His smile sharpened like a blade. "Say that again," he said, his voice cutting through the music. A few people turned, curious. The pianist's hands stilled above the keys. Miss Clara blinked. She hadn't even realized she'd spoken aloud. Just a quiet "excuse me, sir," as she reached past him to collect a glass from the edge of the table. But now all eyes were on her. Her dark skin glowed softly beneath the gold light. Her hair was wrapped neatly, her uniform pressed, her posture straight. Still, her hands trembled around the glass. I said excuse me," she repeated gently, her accent tracing the vowels in a way that made Preston smirk. He leaned closer, one eyebrow arched. "You sound like one of those old island cartoons," he said, voice dripping amusement. He stretched out each word, mimicking her tone, exaggerating it, letting the cruelty bloom slow so everyone could watch. The crowd hesitated, then laughter broke, scattered and awkward at first, then louder, fuller. A man near the bar laughed until he coughed. A woman in diamonds covered her mouth, eyes darting to see if others were laughing too. And when they saw Preston was, they did too. Miss Clara stood still. The glass in her hand shook, the bubbles inside it trembling like her pulse. Her throat tightened, but she didn't speak. She just lowered her eyes, pressing her lips together until they hurt. She had learned long ago that silence could be a kind of armor. Leela Hale watched from across the table. Her husband's laughter felt like acid spilling over silver. Her smile faltered, small at first, then gone completely. For years, she had watched Preston charm rooms just like this one, his jokes, his confidence, the easy way people bowed to him. But tonight, his power looked different, meaner, smaller. She looked at Miss Clara and felt a pull deep in her chest. Because to them, to the cameras, to the donors, to everyone watching, Miss Clara was just the help, a background figure, but Leela knew better. She knew the hands that had braided her hair before every first day of school, the voice that sang her to sleep through the storm when her parents were fighting, the woman who held her when she broke her arm, who prayed over her when her mother died. Miss Clara wasn't the help, she was family. Preston didn't notice the storm building in his wife's silence. He only saw the crowd's attention, felt the sweet pull of it. He took another sip of champagne, still smirking. "You've got to admit," he said to the nearest guest, "that accent's something else. My God, I can barely understand her half the time." Laughter again, crueler this time, a ripple of approval from the powerful, the kind of approval men like Preston fed on. Miss Clara turned away. Her eyes glistened but didn't spill. She had faced worse. The small humiliations that came with every job, the dismissive glances, the questions about where she was really from, the slow, tired patience she carried like a cross. But this was different. This was the man her baby girl once called Uncle Preston. A waiter passed by, whispering softly, "You okay, ma'am?" She nodded once barely. Her lips moved in a quiet prayer, unheard beneath the chatter that filled the room again. At the far end of the hall, the band began to play once more, smooth jazz, warm and empty. The crowd, eager to forget the moment, slipped back into their conversations. But the air had changed. Something cold had settled in the space between them. Even those still smiling could feel it, a thin unease behind every laugh. Leela's gaze never left Miss Clara. She could see how Clara's shoulders lifted slightly with each breath, how she stood a little straighter, refusing to shrink completely. Guilt swelled in Leela's chest, thick and sharp. She had chosen silence when she should have spoken, just like her mother used to. Then came a small sound, a soft, broken chuckle from the corner. Preston turned, surprised. Miss Clara was laughing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. just a single laugh that cut through the noise and froze the room once more. Everyone turned to her. She stood by the table, glass still in hand, eyes calm now. "Funny thing, Mr. Hale," she said softly, her accent still rich, still proud. "You love to talk about voices, but you never learn to listen." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. The crowd fell into a hush so deep you could hear the fizz of the champagne. Preston's jaw tightened. His charm cracked. His hand clenched around his glass until it nearly broke. Leela's heart pounded. She saw her husband's anger spark like a match. He stepped forward, voice low. "Watch yourself," he muttered. But Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes met his, steady and quiet, and in that look there was something he didn't understand, a kind of power that didn't need money or titles. A murmur ran through the guests. The pianist, uncertain, stopped playing again. Someone near the door whispered, "What did she say?" But no one answered. They all just watched. Leela rose from her chair. Her palms were sweating, her throat tight. For the first time she saw her husband the way others must have, not as brilliant, not as magnetic, but as small, small in his cruelty, small in his pride. The silence stretched long, heavy as marble. Then Leela spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "She doesn't need to watch herself," she said. "You do." Every head turned. Preston froze. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the pianist's hands slipped, hitting a wrong note that rang out like a bell. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmuring, glancing between them. Leela reached for Miss Clara's hand, her fingers brushing the rough skin that had once wiped her tears. "Let's go," she whispered. And in that moment, the gold and glass around them didn't shine as bright. The applause from earlier felt cheap, the smiles hollow. As the two women walked toward the door, whispers followed, soft, incredulous. Some faces looked ashamed, others looked scared, but no one stopped them. Preston stood in the center of it all, surrounded by the wealth and power he'd built, and for the first time, none of it felt like respect. Miss Clara didn't look back. She walked with quiet dignity, her shoulders straight, her steps steady. That laugh, the one that had silenced the room, still echoed faintly behind her. And though no one knew it yet, that moment, that tiny act of defiance, would ripple far beyond that ballroom, changing more than just one night. It would shatter every polished lie built on silence. And it all began with a laugh that froze the room. The music played on, but it didn't sound the same. The notes hung heavy in the air, like they too were embarrassed to keep playing. Guests laughed again, or at least pretended to. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed, but underneath the noise something dark lingered. The tension clung like smoke, thick and invisible, curling through the golden light. Mr. Preston Hale stood in the center of it all, smile wide, voice booming. He was back to being the man of the hour, charming, confident, untouchable. He raised his glass high, toasting his investors, his donors, his empire. Each word rolled off his tongue like champagne bubbles. No one dared to mention what had just happened. They smiled, as polite people do, as if cruelty could be erased with a refill. But in the corner of the ballroom, Miss Clara worked quietly. Her face was calm, but her eyes said otherwise. She moved with grace, clearing plates from the white linen tables, folding napkins, avoiding stares. Her hands were steady now, but her chest still felt tight. Every laugh that echoed from across the room made her flinch, even when she told herself it wasn't about her anymore. She had learned how to move through rooms like this, invisible, silent, careful not to disturb the comfort of others. Then from behind her, a soft voice broke through the hum. "Mama," it was Leela. Her heels clicked against the marble as she followed Clara into the back kitchen, past the swinging door that separated glamour from labor. The kitchen was quieter, colder, filled with the smell of detergent and roast. Leela's voice trembled. "I'm so sorry, he didn't mean." Miss Clara turned around, her expression calm but firm. She raised one hand gently. "Don't," she said. "Don't shame yourself for another's ignorance, baby." Her accent wrapped around each word, tender and steady. "I've seen worse. I've survived worse." Leela's throat tightened. She wanted to say more, to defend, to explain, to apologize again, but the words stuck in her chest. Clara's eyes softened as she looked at her, not as an employer or a grown woman in pearls, but as the child she once held through sleepless nights. In that moment, everything shifted. The mansion walls, the money, the titles, none of it mattered. Leela wasn't the CEO's wife anymore. She was just that same little girl, standing barefoot in the hallway, clutching Miss Clara's hand after her parents' fights. The same girl who ran to her for stories when the world felt too cold. Miss Clara brushed her apron with slow hands and smiled faintly. People like him, they love their reflection too much, she said. They can't stand to see someone else shine in it. She turned back to the dishes, her shoulders strong again, her spirit unbroken. Leela watched her in silence, tears blurring her vision. She'd spent years living in Preston's world where charm was currency and silence was safety. But tonight, for the first time, she saw the cost of that silence. It had taken her mother's love, her peace, and now her dignity. And for what? To keep a man comfortable in his own arrogance. Back in the ballroom, the crowd had returned to its rhythm. Waiters floated by with dessert trays. The band played louder now, as if sound alone could drown out shame. Preston was holding court near the fireplace, laughing at his own story. A young investor leaned in close, his tone light but curious. "That your wife's maid." Preston smirked, his ego still hungry for an audience. "Maury like her babysitter who never left," he said with a chuckle. The crowd laughed, not because it was funny, but because they knew who signed the checks. He didn't notice that Leela had stepped back into the room. Her hand was still trembling from holding Clara's, and her eyes were red but sharp. She stood behind him, listening to every word, each syllable cutting a little deeper. "Babysitter who never left." He said it again, louder this time, like a joke he thought would land better the second time around. The people around him forced out more laughter, brittle and hollow. But then the laughter began to fade. A hush swept across the space. Someone turned, then another. The pianist stopped mid-note. Preston's smile faltered when he realized everyone was no longer looking at him. They were looking past him. Leela was standing there beside Miss Clara. Their hands were clasped, one pale, one dark, joined together in the kind of silence that demanded attention, the kind that carried history, the kind that no money could buy or break. Miss Clara didn't look angry. She didn't need to. Her calm presence said everything. Her chin lifted just enough to meet the stares. She had been humiliated in this room, and now she stood in it again, unbent. The light from the chandelier caught her face, making her glow. And though she said nothing, everyone could feel it, the shift, the quiet rise of dignity. Preston turned slowly, eyes darting between his wife and the woman he had mocked. "Leela," he said with a careful smile, his charm trying to patch the cracks. "You're back. We were just talking about me." Miss Clara's voice was soft but steady. Preston froze. The same accent he had ridiculed now filled the room with power. "Seems like you know my story better than I do, sir." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Preston's lips parted, searching for something clever, but nothing came. Leela took a small step forward, her fingers tightening around Clara's. "This woman," she said, voice trembling, "is not our maid. She's not our babysitter. She's family. She raised me. She taught me what grace looks like, something you clearly never learned." Gasps spread like sparks. The guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to stay or slip away. Some looked embarrassed, others fascinated, but no one spoke. Preston's face turned pale, his composure slipping away piece by piece. He forced a laugh that fell flat. "Honey, let's not make a scene," he whispered through his teeth. But Leela didn't lower her voice. "You already did," she said, "when you mocked the only woman in this room who's ever shown you real kindness." The silence that followed was louder than the music had ever been. Preston looked around, realizing that for the first time, no one was laughing with him. They were watching him, the great Mr. Hale, shrink under the weight of his own arrogance. Miss Clara looked at him once more, her expression unreadable. "You know," she said quietly, "when you laugh at someone's accent, you tell the world what kind of heart you have." She let the words settle, slow and deliberate. Then she turned away, still holding Leela's hand. They began to walk out, side by side, through the stunned crowd. The pianist stood frozen, the melody unfinished. Glasses trembled on the tables. Somewhere in the back, a flash went off someone's phone, capturing the moment no one would forget. As they reached the doorway, Clara paused and looked back one last time. "You should be careful, Mr. Hale," she said softly. "Pride makes a man forget who's really watching." Then she stepped through the doors, and the crowd parted without a word. Behind them, Preston stood in the echo of silence, surrounded by people, but suddenly very, very alone. The polite smiles had vanished, and for the first time that night, he understood something he'd never known before: respect isn't bought with money, it's earned with decency. The band never started playing again. The room was supposed to belong to him. Every chandelier, every polished marble tile, every name engraved on the donation plaques, all of it was Preston Hale's kingdom. But at that moment, it was. Because when Leela stepped toward the stage, the air in that grand ballroom shifted. People turned their heads, whispers followed her like shadows, and the soft click of her heels echoed louder than the orchestra. The host, confused but smiling, held out the microphone as if unsure whether this was part of the program. Leela's hand trembled slightly as she took it, but her eyes were steady, the kind of steady that comes right before something sacred breaks free. Preston's smile faltered when he saw her step into the spotlight. He had seen that look before, in meetings, in interviews, in those rare moments when his wife refused to play along. But tonight, in front of hundreds of guests and flashing cameras, that look terrified him. "Leela," he whispered under his breath, trying to mask his irritation with charm. "What are you doing?" Her voice quivered on the first word, but grew stronger with each breath. "I want to introduce someone," she said, "the woman who made me who I am." The room stiffened. The donors, the reporters, the executives, they all turned, puzzled, expecting maybe a mentor, a philanthropist, a guest of honor. But Leela's eyes weren't on them. They were fixed on Miss Clara, who stood at the edge of the crowd, still dressed in her simple uniform, hands folded neatly in front of her. Gasps rippled across the hall like a quiet storm. Cameras adjusted. A few faces twisted in disbelief. One woman whispered, "That's the nanny," and another said, "Is she serious?" But Leela didn't flinch. Preston took a step closer to the stage, his voice low and urgent. "Leela, this isn't the time. We'll talk about this later." His smile strained, his jaw tight. He could feel eyes turning toward him, waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to control the moment like he always did. But this time, he couldn't. Leela looked at him, really looked at him, and the years of silence, of smiling through disrespect, of pretending not to notice his arrogance, came pouring out in that one calm stare. "You mocked her accent," she said into the microphone, her voice steady now. "But that voice sang me to sleep when my mother died." The room went still, not a whisper, not a movement, even the clinking of glasses stopped. Leela took a slow breath, the kind that carries years of buried truth. "You call her the help, you laugh at her voice, but that woman taught me what love sounds like, what grace looks like. When my father couldn't show it, she did." A murmur rippled through the crowd, small gasps, shifting feet, a few hands covering mouths. Preston's smile collapsed completely. He could feel his control slipping, feel the foundation of his reputation cracking in front of the very people he'd spent years impressing. "Leela, stop this," he hissed, stepping closer to the stage. "You're embarrassing yourself." She turned toward him, and for the first time her expression carried no fear, only truth. "No," she said, "you embarrassed yourself." Her voice didn't shout, but it carried like thunder through that gold-lit hall. "You humiliated a woman who gave up her life to raise me. You tried to make her small so you could feel big." Miss Clara stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. She didn't know where to look, at the daughter she raised or the man who mocked her. Her hands twisted together, trembling slightly, but she didn't move forward. She just stood there, silent, strong, glowing in the way that only truth makes a person glow. Leela's eyes softened as she turned toward her. And she said, voice trembling with emotion, is not just a nanny. She paused, her throat tightening as tears filled her eyes. She's my mother. The words seemed to break the air. The orchestra stopped mid-note. The ballroom froze. Gasps turned into silence so deep it felt holy. Preston's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor, echoing like a confession. No one dared to move. Cameras flashed, catching the moment, the tears in Leela's eyes, the disbelief on Preston's face, the quiet strength in Miss Clara's. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Did she say mother?" Another voice answered, "She did." Preston's face went pale. He glanced at the cameras, at the investors, at the faces of people who had once feared him, now watching him crumble. "Leela, you're confused," he stammered. She's not." Leela cut him off with a look so sharp he couldn't finish. "Don't you dare," her voice was low, fierce. "Don't you dare rewrite my life to protect your image." Miss Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her chin lifted. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than anything Preston could say. It was the silence of a woman who had endured, who had given love without recognition, who had carried the weight of another family's world and asked for nothing in return. Leela stepped down from the stage and walked toward her. The crowd parted without a word, the sound of her heels echoing in the hush. When she reached Miss Clara, she didn't speak at first. She just reached out and took her hand, the same hand that had held hers through childhood, through grief, through every moment when love had been the only thing holding her together. Tears rolled down both their faces. The room watched, transfixed, as the two women stood hand in hand, a mother and daughter reunited not by blood, but by truth. Preston took another step forward, his voice trembling now. "You're ruining me," he said quietly, but the microphone still caught it. "You don't understand what this looks like." Leela turned to face him, still holding Clara's hand. "It looks like honesty," she said, "something this house has been missing for a long time." A few of the guests lowered their eyes. Some nodded slightly, as if seeing something they'd been too afraid to name. Others looked away in discomfort, the kind that comes when privilege is forced to confront itself. Cameras continued to flash, capturing Preston's shame, Leela's defiance, and Clara's grace. For years, Preston Hale had built his world on perception, on polished words, grand gestures, and carefully curated charm. But tonight, under the weight of a truth he couldn't control, all of it fell apart. Miss Clara looked at him once, her voice soft but steady. "A man's character shows when he thinks no one important is watching," she said. "But God was watching, child, always has been." The words hit him harder than any shout could. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for support, but all he found were blank stares. Then came the sound, the one thing no one expected: applause. It started soft, hesitant from the back of the room, then another, then more. Soon, the ballroom that had once laughed at Clara's accent was clapping for her strength. Leela turned to her, smiling through tears. "You deserve this," she whispered. Miss Clara's voice broke for the first time that night. "No, baby," she said, squeezing her hand. "We both do." And as the applause swelled, Preston stood frozen, the weight of his arrogance heavy on his chest. The cameras caught everything, not the man who ruled a company, but the man who'd lost his soul trying to rule over others. That night, the world would see a different story, not one about wealth or power, but about a voice once mocked that rose above it all. And in that silence after the applause, one truth remained clear: dignity doesn't need a title, it just needs courage to speak its name. When the last note of the orchestra faded and the lights dimmed, something in that grand ballroom had changed forever. The guests who once clung to Preston Hale's every word now avoided his gaze. The applause that used to follow his speeches no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the woman he had tried to humiliate. Miss Clara stood at the edge of the room, her hands still trembling slightly, her eyes glistening under the gold light. The sound of clapping rolled through the hall like thunder, not polite applause, but something purer, something grateful. The kind that came from people who had seen truth break through glamour. Preston tried to smile, but it was empty, strained. For the first time in his life, he felt small. Cameras flashed, but not for him. The headlines were already being written in whispers. The night the mask fell, the billionaire's cruel joke turned on him. Every guest had their own version, but all carried the same ending. Miss Clara's dignity had outshined his wealth. When the doors finally closed and the crowd drifted into the night, the ballroom felt haunted not by ghosts, but by regret. The chandeliers still glowed, but the warmth was gone. Preston lingered, staring at the shards of glass he had dropped earlier, the mess no one had cleaned. He crouched down and picked one up, turning it in his hand, watching how it caught the light. Even broken, it shimmered. That thought stayed with him longer than he expected. In the days that followed, the empire he'd built on image began to crack. Investors called with concerns. Sponsors pulled funding. PR teams scrambled, desperate to contain the firestorm. But no amount of money could erase the footage, Leela's trembling voice, Miss Clara's calm defiance, his own smirk turning to shock. Every time he turned on the news, there it was. The replay, the shame, the lesson. For the first time, silence followed Preston Hale everywhere he went. He stopped going into the office. He ignored calls. He sat in his study, staring at the rows of awards and photos lining his wall, all symbols of power that now felt like lies. Beneath the polished wood and glass, he saw something hollow. He thought about that moment when Miss Clara had looked at him, unafraid, and said, "You didn't learn to listen." Those words replayed in his mind, over and over, louder than any headline. 3 days later, he found himself driving across town. No chauffeur, no cameras, just him. The streets looked different from behind the wheel, smaller, realer, like the world had more edges than he remembered. He followed the address Leela had written on a slip of paper before she left for her mother's house. He hadn't seen her since that night. The mansion felt too big without her laughter, too quiet without her voice. When he reached the modest apartment building, he hesitated. It was simple, painted in soft yellow, with flowers growing along the steps. He sat in the car for almost 10 minutes, staring at the front door, wondering what he could possibly say. But eventually, he got out. The hallway smelled faintly of jasmine and detergent. He could hear a TV playing somewhere, a child laughing, life happening. When he reached her door, his hand hovered for a moment before knocking. Softly, once, twice. The door opened, and there she was, Miss Clara, dressed in a plain blue blouse, her hair tied neatly, her face calm. She looked exactly the same, and somehow completely different. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Preston swallowed hard and said, "Miss Clara, his voice broke. He cleared his throat, trying again. "I came to say I'm sorry, I didn't know." Her eyes didn't harden, but they didn't soften either. She looked at him quietly, letting the weight of his words hang between them. Then, with that same calm strength she'd shown in the ballroom, she said, "You didn't want to know." The sentence hit him like truth always does, clean, sharp, undeniable. He dropped his gaze, nodding slowly. "You're right," he said. "I didn't." Silence stretched between them. He shifted his weight, unsure whether to speak again, but she spared him the effort. "Mr. Hale," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "I don't hate you. Hate don't fix hearts. But I do hope you understand respect is not a gift. It's a reflection." Preston nodded, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "I do," he whispered. "Now I do." For the first time in his life, he realized how blind wealth could make a person, how easy it was to live high above the world and never see the people holding it up. He looked around her apartment, the framed photos, the crocheted blanket, the small vase of wildflowers on the table. It was nothing like the mansion, but it felt more like home than his house ever had. Miss Clara gestured toward the door with a faint smile. "Go on now," she said softly. There's work waiting for you, just not the kind you used to do." He nodded again, unable to find the right words. As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Mr. Hale," she said, and he stopped. "When you learn to hear people, really hear them, then maybe your laughter will sound like something good again." He smiled faintly, his throat tight. "I'll try," he said, and for once he meant it. Back at the mansion, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of pride anymore, it was the silence of change. Leela had returned home the day before, though they hadn't spoken much. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, taking down photos from the walls, boxing up the awards, replacing things without explanation. That evening, Preston walked into the main hall and stopped. On the wall where their wedding portrait once hung, a new frame had taken its place. Inside it was a photo, Leela and Miss Clara, standing in the backyard years ago. Leela was maybe 10, missing a tooth, smiling wide. Clara was beside her, laughing, sunlight in her eyes. No designer gowns, no luxury, just joy. Underneath the frame, a small brass plaque read, "The woman who taught me love." Preston stood there for a long time, his eyes stinging. He reached out and touched the frame, tracing Clara's face with his fingertip. For the first time in years, he felt something honest rise inside him, humility. Outside, the world kept talking. Reporters called that night the reckoning, the awakening, the fall of the golden man. But for the people who truly mattered, it became something else entirely. The night respect came home. And long after the lights dimmed, one truth lingered like a whisper through the halls. Never measure a person by their accent, their job, or their skin, because some voices carry lullabies that raised kings. And some laughter, the kind that once humiliated, carries lessons that money will never buy. That night, Preston Hale finally understood. The most powerful people in this world aren't the ones with chandeliers above them. They're the ones whose light comes from within.